And now we are live streaming on Facebook. Awesome. Amanda from Portland, how are you?
Yes, Melanie, thanks for asking. There will be a Facebook Live link. We have it on one of our slides and we'll be sure to share it soon. And somebody may beat us to it and be able to share it in the chat possibly.
I'll share it in just a second.
Thank you, Mon. Y'all, if you're just joining us, feel free and change your chat settings to panelists and attendees. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and represent. We're glad to have you here. We'll start in a little bit.
Oh, there it is.
There's the link. Thank you, Josh. Look at these people from all over the US and all over the world. This is exciting.
I think we're almost ready.
That sounds good. Maybe we can queue up the first slide and be ready to go.
Yes, I'll get it started.
Thank you, Mon. All right. Do we think it's a time to start, Royal?
I believe so. I think this is good.
Cool. Well, thank you all for joining us for our kind of webinar and Q&A around connecting struggles between Filipino, Palestinian, and Black liberation. We have so many great speakers here and a whole bunch of fun content to cover, as well as some actions that we can take towards the end. So looking forward to that. And we'll probably start now.
Awesome. We have our webinar procedures. Feel free and connect with everybody in the general chat. We also have a Q&A button here at the bottom where you can ask questions, which will be read at the end of this towards the end of this webinar. Please share this Facebook Live link at the Palestinian Youth Movement Facebook page. The link is also in the chat. And like I said, with the Q&A window, it will be there. So please ask as we're presenting, and we will read that and answer these questions towards the end of the webinar. Awesome. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Royal and I'm from Malaya, Texas. I will be one of your MCs tonight.
And hi, y'all. My name is Kevin. Happy to be here. Super excited. I'm from Austin, and I'm here with the Austin Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, aka CHRP, and I'll also be one of the MCs.
Today, July 17th, is a National Day of Action against the Anti-Terror Law. Currently, it's July 18th in the Philippines, which means this law is now in effect. At this time, the Duterte government can legally arrest and surveil anyone who criticizes his administration under the justification of protecting the country against terrorists. We're seeing parallels of events today happening now in events that unfolded during the Marcos regime. One common denominator is the attack on free press. Journalists are murdered and arrested on trumped-up charges with while misinformation campaigns are carried out by the administration. For the second time in history, ABS-CBN, the largest and longest-running news network of the Philippines, was recently taken off the air. The last time this happened was in September 1972, when then-President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines. 14 years later, they came back on air to broadcast the historic People Power uprising that toppled Marcos. We are organizing this event to support the Filipino people's resistance against this law meant to silence the masses.
In our event tonight, we'd also like to make connections to similar struggles that communities around the world are experiencing. Specifically, we're going to talk about the political repression faced by our Black siblings here in the US, as well as the people of Palestine.
During this time of worsening violations, our rights as people around the globe, it's important to link arms, learn from each other, and be in solidarity with one another. Police and state brutality are issues that cut across communities. We'll be playing a video here now, and stay tuned.
Sorry, y'all. Were you able to hear the video?
No, I don't think we were, Iman.
Oh, okay, here.
There we go. Yes, thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has signed an anti-terrorism bill into law amid widespread opposition and fear.
This bill carry out state terrorism against the people with absolutely no respect for the right to free speech and assembly.
Sa panahong nagugutom at walang nakakain mamayang Pilipino, walang ayuda at mga namamatay sa pandemyang dulot ng COVID-19, ang inuna ni Duterte ay ang pagkukonsolida sa kanyang kapangyarihan sa pamamagitan ng pagpasa sa anti-terror bill.
How many more women will be murdered like our trans sibling Jennifer Lade, who was violently murdered at the hands of the US military in the Philippines? How many more mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, titas will be forced to leave their families and their children to find work abroad just to survive? Gabriela USA calls on all women and our allies all over the world to join the Filipino people's mass movement to oust Duterte once and for all. Tama na, enough is enough.
This is happening all in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and record-breaking unemployment rates. Filipino families across the nation are struggling to put food on the table. We see that this is an example of Duterte's weak stomach for criticism and his bloodthirst for unquestioned power.
Let us not be deceived to view solidarity as a choice or just an extra action to take in our day, but let us view solidarity as a necessary and integral commitment in building just and lasting peace in our world.
Europeans are under attack. What we do? Stand up, fight back.
Awesome. Again, we want to remind the audience that you can ask your questions in the comments section of the Facebook Live video or through privately messaging the questions in the Q&A or in the Q&A button. So our first speaker this evening is Jennifer Miller. Jennifer is co-chair of the Dallas Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Jennifer is a mom to a 3-year-old little boy and has been involved in local organizing in North Texas for 4 years.
We'll also have Reneen here, and she's a Palestinian organizer based out of Dallas, Texas. She's a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement Dallas, and she started organizing as a student at UT Austin with the Palestine Solidarity Committee.
And we have Charles Jimenez. Charles Jimenez is a youth organizer from Anakbayan, a youth organization that fights for land, wages, jobs, education, and democratic rights in the Philippines. He served as the vice chairperson of the University of the Philippines Manila University Student Council. He then served as the regional spokesperson for National Union of Students of the Philippines to fight for free education and youth rights before he migrated to Texas.
And lastly, we'll also have Sarah Halindoon. Sarah is a first-generation Filipino American activist and organizer from Chicago, Illinois. She is currently the Texas coordinator for Malaya Movement Texas, living in DFW. Her work has varied from immigration reform, organizing with families of victims of police brutality, and now focuses on human rights for the Philippines.
And next slide, I will be handing off the mic to Jennifer Miller. Jennifer, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. If we could go back to the previous slide, actually, just so I can give a background of our organization. Thank you. So, like it says, I'm with the Dallas Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. I'm co-chair of the organization. And I actually have here our mission statement. So we fight, or we work to end police misconduct, prison profiteering, racist and political repression, and economic injustice. So our strategy is not to merely be reactive towards incidents of state-sanctioned violence and repression, but to build towards meaningful change in the power dynamic between our and the police. We're actually the Dallas chapter of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression that was refounded last year in November. Next slide. All right, so the first thing that I want to go over is kind of like the history of policing in the United States. So we first, of course, have to start out with slave patrols. They were an early form of policing. So slavery is what built the United States, but especially the southern states. They heavily depended on slave labor to have any of the income that they had, as well as the power and also maintaining the white supremacist myth that is brought over with colonialism and imperialism. So because the slave populations in the southern states were so high, it gave a rise to a fear of slave rebellions. And because of that, we then the answer to that was slave patrols. So according to a historian named Gary Potter, these slave patrols, they actually served purposes. One was chasing down runaway slaves and returning them to their masters, organizing terror to prevent slave revolts, as well as maintaining a form of discipline for slaves who were subject to attack if they were to have been caught violating plantation rules. Next slide. All right, so with the history of that, being said, what does this mean for us today? Like, what function does the police serve in the United States now? So to give a little bit more background to that, economic elites and the bourgeoisie in the 19th century had a vested interest in social control, and they needed a mechanism to ensure a quote unquote stable and orderly workforce and environment to conduct business. So at this time also in history, you need to also keep in mind factory production was on the rise, and the Industrial Revolution, first happening in England and then spreading across the rest of the colonialist world. Maintaining a compliant workforce was very important. Factories running smoothly. So there were multiple different types of propaganda that the bourgeoisie at this time used to actually justify the consolidation of policing and to create the modern police force that we have today. They referred to the working class people as quote unquote dangerous classes, which I have here, pretty much ran the gambit from people that were struggling from addiction, like public drunkenness and things like that, protesters, which funny enough, even back then, people who were just striking for better conditions were referred to as rioters, similar to how protesters, especially in the wake of George Floyd's death, have been referred to, and people who have committed crimes for whatever reason they may have to commit them, right? Oftentimes this is a dog whistle, and the people who make up these dangerous classes are poor people, immigrants, and freed black slaves. It's really funny that a lot of the same kind of logic and thinking and racist policies really that have been implemented centuries before are still having an impact on the way that policing is done today. We can go on to the next slide. So just to continue on that, the police grew out of a need during the rise of industrial capitalism to maintain control over the populace, to prevent things like strikes and protests against their conditions, America's racism and its racial hierarchy, and also to prevent the disruption of the status quo. A lot of the things that they were wanting to have the police stop were problems that were caused by the system itself. Like public drunkenness wouldn't have been an issue if there wasn't, saloons and bars and places that sold alcohol where they actually encourage you to consume that alcohol in a public place, right? People wouldn't be turning to committing crimes if they had living wages. These are all things that, because the bourgeoisie at the time were not willing, and still now are not willing, to maintain a system or to have a system where people can actually survive on the labors or on the wages that they're getting, they then criminalize the people who are reacting to the circumstances that they find themselves in a very expected. So going further, what does that mean for us today in the 21st century? First, the legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism are immeasurable. And descendants of historically dispossessed people still feel the impacts of these actions today. We can go to the next slide. All right, so just to continue on, so Neil Franklin, he's actually a Black police officer who worked for decades for the Baltimore Police Department and the Maryland State Police, said that even he, as a Black man, felt a strong bias against other Black men. I have a quote here directly from Franklin. He says, "When I'd see a young Black male in a particular neighborhood, or his pants were sagging a little bit, or he walked a certain way, my first thoughts were, oh, I wonder if he's selling drugs." So Black and brown officers are just as complicit in police crimes as white ones, and oftentimes are just as likely to brutalize, maim, and kill Black and brown people, if not more so than white police officers. So the problem with policing goes deeper than just individual police officers and individual biases. Even Black and brown police officers have these same biases. So it speaks to a culture of policing that, and the roots of that culture of policing is slave patrols and is maintaining quo, whether that's America's racial hierarchy and also late stage capitalism. So like it says, you know, the nature of policing is inherently racist and inherently classist. It has these roots of slave patrols, even the roots of slave patrols notwithstanding, policing today is often more done in areas with more Black and brown residents, which leads to an overrepresentation of these groups in the criminal justice system. Actually, a study done the, if I remember correctly, let me make sure that I have it. I want to say the exact name of the agency that did it. That way nobody can come for me later. So when we actually look at a study done by the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that was published in 2013, 9.5% of white people admitted to using illicit drugs in the past month, compared to 10.5% of Black people. But then when we look at 2013 FBI statistics on drug-related arrests per 100,000 residents of each race, we see that 332 whites were arrested compared to a staggering number of 879 Black people, right? Even though drug use in this case is often, these rates are very similar, because of the way that policing is done, we see an immense overrepresentation of Black and brown people in cages for crimes, quote unquote, that a white person wouldn't have been arrested for or even charged for. We can go. Okay, so just talk a little bit about political repression and tie that into the anti-terror law. And also to tie, I don't have it here on this slide, that's my mistake, but I'm also going to tie in a lot of that with the Palestinian movement as well. So just to go into COINTELPRO a little bit, it was an FBI and CIA operation that infiltrated and destroyed groups seeking liberation for Black people in the United States during the social rights movement and continual uprisings in the 70s. Some famous organizations that were infiltrated by COINTELPRO include the Black Panther Party, as well as the Communist Party of the United States. So currently, the US government has taken to referring to Black Lives Matter activists as Black identity extremists in order to delegitimize the movement for Black liberation. The US government, sorry, that's my little one. The US government, through the Patriot Act, is actually able to indefinitely detain people without charges. And we see actually today that in New York, as of the wake of George Floyd shootings, there are protesters who are being held indefinitely with no charges, without bond today. And because of the Patriot Act, they were able to do that. So similar to the Patriot, the anti-terror law, what's up? You can, oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So similar to the Patriot Act, the anti-terror law in the Philippines, the Duterte regime has also provided itself with indefinite detention powers and has already had multiple abuses of these powers by stifling political activism within the Philippines. And this law, and especially its indefinite detention powers that it grants, are a further attack on the rights of Filipinos. And just to tie into the political repression that's been happening with Palestinian activism, Rasmia Ade is actually a member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, who's been a stalwart and unmovable Palestinian woman and revolutionary for Palestinian liberation. And what's the issue? He just wants, I don't know what it is. I guess he wants to look at my hands. So you want to watch a show on my phone really quick? Sorry, you guys. This is mom life. He doesn't care that I have stuff to do. You want to watch Peppa Pig on my phone? Hold on 1 second. Okay, baby. Here's Peppa. Okay. So to tie that in, she was actually deported on very, very flimsy grounds, and it was specifically because of her work with for Palestinian liberation. And with the Palestinian question as well, another thing that I wanted to highlight is actually that police officers in the United States are trained by IDF soldiers to use the tactics that they do, knee on neck, extrajudicial killings, the whole gambit. And the IDF actually uses these same tactics that they're training to US police officers on Palestinian people. And it's important that we make these links between these different struggles because those links are there. The US, the police officer, Derek Chauvin, who actually murdered George Floyd, actually was one of the police officers who was trained to use that exact same technique by Israeli Defense Force soldiers. So police violence here in the United States has a direct link with police violence in the Palestinian community and in Palestine, and police violence here and political repression here in the United States has a direct link with Palestinian and Filipino political repression as well as police repression. And okay, yeah, we can go to the next slide. Sorry. All right, so one of our big campaign pushes that we have is actually for community control of the police. Over here on the right, we have a photo on the top of a protest in Chicago, also calling for community control, and then our protest down here in Dallas on the bottom. So what community control of the police would look like? It would be a civilian-made and democratically elected police accountability council made up of members who live in the districts that they represent. So for example, in the city of Dallas, you know, we don't need people who are living in Highland Park, which is a majority white, very wealthy area, making decisions about the policing happening in Pleasant Grove, which is a majority minority South Dallas and very poor area of the city. They don't have the same needs, they don't have the same experiences of dealing with the police, so it doesn't make any sense for those people to be in any way involved in the decision making of the policing of these different communities. So these councils would be made up of people who actually live in those communities, and they would be the ones actually making the hiring and firing decisions, making decisions about the budget, as well as holding police accountable for the crime they commit, whether that be a reprimand, a suspension, or all the way to bringing charges and indicting killer cops and cops who terrorize the city. And that's really it. I think that's my last slide, actually.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for dropping some real truth and knowledge and educating us. We feel, or I feel the love coming from the chat so much. So, and I want to extra thank you for playing both roles today, of making sure your little one's okay and ready to go, and also still taking the time to educate us. So thank you so much. I want to remind our friends, if you do want to show some love, you can show some love to just us, the panelists, or you can share it with everybody too if you want to change your settings from all panelists to all panelists and attendees, I believe is what it is. And so, yeah, with that, thank you so much again. We'll pass it on to Reneen to talk a little bit more about the Palestine struggle and the things that are happening over there. Thanks for joining us, Reneen.
Hello, everyone. I think everyone can hear me. So as was mentioned in my introduction, my name is Reneen, and I'm so excited and honored to be here with you all. I'm a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, and I currently am a member of the Dallas chapter. So for those of you who don't know, the PYM is a grassroots volunteer-based organization made up of Palestinian and Arab youth that are taking an active role in the struggle for the liberation of our homeland and people. We bring youth together across cultural, political, and social backgrounds to organize towards the right of return for all refugees and the dismantling of Zionism. We have chapters all over the US and Canada, and we're engaged in a variety of projects from mutual aid efforts in response to COVID currently, to the empowerment of our communities through local BDS campaigns and educational, political, and cultural workshops. Before joining the PYM, I was a student organizer at UT Austin, and I was also a member of the Palestine Solidarity Committee. So today I hope to briefly discuss the Palestinian struggle for liberation and share some of my experiences and our experiences of political repression here in the United States. Also, there's like a QR code on the screen if you guys want to scan that, and it'll take you to our website if you want to learn more about some of the things that the PYM is doing. I believe we can go to the next slide. So before we talk about political repression, I just wanted to provide a framework for our discussion and really kind of explain how we understand the Palestinian struggle and the framework we use to talk about it. So the Palestinian struggle is a struggle against Zionism and settler colonialism. And in its current form, the settler colonial project is enforced through a system of apartheid and occupation. So quickly, I'm just going to help define some of those terms. We can go to the next slide. So there's Zionism, and there's two definitions. So Zionism from the standpoint of its supporters is the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, so from the standpoint of Palestinians and all those that it oppresses, it is a settler colonial movement whose goal was the establishment of a Jewish state on the ruins and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So when we define settler colonialism, we're defining it as a process by which a foreign people, which the foreign people in this context are the Jewish people, under the oversight of an imperial power, which that was Britain, and it establishes settlement as a part of a larger colonial project that involves the necessary displacement of the indigenous people, which are the Palestinians. So that's the framework we understand the Palestinian struggle, and just some things to quickly go over. It's important when we're talking about settler colonialism and Zionism being a settler colonial project, we understand that Zionism manifests itself into the daily lives of Palestinians. So we can go on to the next slide, actually. So like for Palestinians day to day, settler colonialism and Zionism as a project, it requires the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And it does that to maintain an artificial Jewish majority that the state of Israel wants to have, but it doesn't necessarily have, which means the forcible removal of the Palestinian population. And it does that through apartheid, and we see apartheid through checkpoints. We see it through the imprisonment of Palestinian children. We see it through restriction of Palestinian movement. We see it through the erection of this apartheid wall, which is erected on Palestinian land. And then we also see it through just a bunch of other methods. And the ultimate goal of the Zionist project through this apartheid system is to make Palestinian life so unlivable so that either Palestinians will die, they will leave, or they will die, or they will get so tired that they will leave. And that's the ultimate goal. So I wanted to lay that out before we talk about how Palestinians are resisting here in the United States. We can go on to the next slide, I think. So our struggle for liberation has been ongoing for decades, both inside and outside of Palestine. And there's a long history of Palestinian organizing in the United States, from the student movement to the youth organizing in the solidarity scene, and then the creation of village societies. Our work has drawn a lot from the experiences of the Black struggle here in the United States, And we continue to uphold and build upon the historical legacy and connection between the Black struggle for liberation in this country and the fight for liberation in Palestine. So for me, also just breaking this down, for political repression, we see it, well, for political repression, we see it in like 3 ways. So we can break it down in suppression of student activism, and then we can also see it through anti-BDS legislation, and then we also see it through the direct criminalization of Palestinians through our court system and through our prisons. So we can go on to the next slide. So for me, I started out as a solidarity organizer as a student at UT with the Palestine Solidarity Committee, and our mission was to educate the campus about Palestine, and it was to combat Zionism and to combat the Zionist narrative of our struggle on campus. So organizing on campus wasn't always necessarily easy, and some of my first experiences and some of our first experiences with the Zionist repression on a college campus were when we attempted to run a divestment campaign. And that was a campaign that called on the university to divest from corporations that profit off of the suffering of Palestinians. So this is one of the ways that the BDS movement pushed students on college campuses to talk about Palestine. So just quickly, the BDS movement calls upon the international community to boycott the state of Israel. So that would mean withdrawing support from Israeli and international companies involved in the violation of Palestinian human rights. Divesting from Israel would mean urging banks, churches, and universities to to withdraw their investments from corporations involved in violations of Palestinian human rights. And finally, that would mean sanctioning Israel by pressuring governments to hold Israel accountable by ending military trade or free trade agreements, or expelling Israel from international forums such as the UN. So that's kind of what the BDS is based upon. And it was called upon in 2009 by Palestinian civil society. So we attempted to run a divestment campaign, and with that we saw, we can go to the next slide, we saw Zionists employ a number of tactics to suppress Palestinian voices on campus and Palestinian dissent. So Zionists ran smear campaigns against our student group. They likened us to terrorists on campus. Many of our members were added to the notorious Zionist blacklisting page called Canary Mission. And this website creates profiles on any pro-Palestinian activist, from academics to students to anyone that may have a public profile and talks about Palestine, essentially calling them terrorists and attempting to ruin their academic and professional career. And the website is very Islamophobic and really racist, and it plays upon a lot of really Islamophobic tropes. It also has many members within the movement banned from returning to Palestine based on their profiles. In 2017, a BDS blacklist was launched in response to the increased BDS activism on college campuses, where Israel publishes the blacklists of BDS groups to be barred from entering the country. And then in 2019, a news report called smear campaign called Terrorists in Suits was also launched to reveal like the true nature of BDS activists, which is just another Islamophobic and racist tactic used to criminalize Palestinians standing up for themselves. So if you guys look here, this is just it's like a ridiculous poster that was like allowed on a campus somewhere, I believe it was somewhere in California. So these are just some of the tactics that Zionists will go to. Well, these are some of the links that Zionists will go to by posting things like this on a college campus. And oftentimes colleges won't do anything to remove them because it's an attack of Palestinian students. So if we go to the next slide, I believe, actually, no, we can stay on this slide. So there's something called the Palestinian exception to free speech on campus. And as a student organizer with PSC, we also saw this during during a demonstration against a university event that was highlighting the Israeli Defense Force, which if you don't know what the Israeli Defense Force is, they're the military body that upholds and carries out Israel's violence against Palestinians. And so there was an event on campus that was glorifying the IDF, and PSC organized a peaceful demonstration walkout of this event, and we're Palestinian students were violently attacked and confronted by a UT professor and graduate student. And the professor, after that attack, used their UT website webpage to disseminate private information about students. And they insinuated that the Palestinian students on campus were soon to be terrorists, and they likened our actions to, that was the time of the Paris attacks, and they likened us to those attackers, and they labeled us red flags for terrorism. And surprisingly enough, the UT administration never took any actions on our behalf as students, and the university never publicly acknowledged that we were physically harassed, and they never admitted to the fact that the professor abused his power by publishing on a UT website and likening us to terrorists on a university page. And instead, we were just met with empty, vague, and accusatory statements, while our own members were met with death threats and potential suspension from the university. So we've seen that, those were some of the experiences we had in PSC, but we also see punishment of professors and pro-Palestinian academics for doing nothing other than just making comments or just having certain beliefs. So there's an example of Stephen Salida. He was a former University of Illinois urban Champaign professor. He was wrongfully fired for tweets condemning Israel's Operations Protective Edge in Gaza. So he literally got fired from his position just for making a tweet about what Israel was doing. That summer, there's also another example of Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi. She's a professor at San Francisco State University, and she's the founder and director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program. And she's faced repression and smear campaigns from Zionists, and then the university actually is refusing to hire any new professors for her program, and they've denied her research support. She's currently suing the university in collusion with pro-Israel groups for harassment and retaliation against her because of her teaching, research, and advocacy for Palestine. So that's just some of the experiences on a college campus. So we can go on to the next slide. After leaving college, I began to see the way political repression of our work looks on a larger scale. So after 2015, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement really became a strategic threat to the state of Israel. And they shifted from rebranding efforts to taking more legal recourse. So the Ministry of Strategic Affairs for Israel was tasked with, defeating BDS, and they have almost a $25 million budget to deal with the problem of BDS. So Israel really sees BDS as a threat to them. In the United States, we see a federal bill in 2009 being put out, and this bill was an attempt to authorize the state and local governments to pass laws that prohibit the state from contracting with or divesting from entities that boycott Israel. So we've seen this on a national level, and I think it's really small, but it kind of lays out this map, legislation that's been enacted and brought forth across the state. But yeah, so that's what we see in the forms of legislation. So the last area I wanted to just briefly mention is the actual criminalization of Palestinians in the United States. And here there is a picture that talks about demanding freedom for the Holy Land Five. So the case of the Holy Land Five is a prime example of the criminalization and suppression of Palestinian activism and organizations in the United States. So more than a decade ago, 5 Palestinian Americans in the United States, Palestinian Americans that include Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan al-Ashi, Muhammad al-Mazen, Mufida Abdul Qadir, and Abdul Rahman O'Day, known as the Holy Land Five, were unjustly convicted on false charges of providing material support for terrorism. So they ran the largest Muslim charity in the United States. And the Holy Land Foundation did nothing but provide charity to the same organizations that the US government was also providing charity to in Palestine. Their case and trial was considered the largest terrorism financing case in US history, but prosecutors did not argue that the charity had ever officially funded any violence, but they argued and told jurors that the schools, hospitals, and social welfare programs that the charity sent money to were under Hamas's control. Since money is fungible, these prosecutors were able to argue that those donations freed up other funds for these terrorist groups to invest in violent attacks. And like I said before, the irony of this all is that these same Palestinian charities also received donations from the US Agency for International Development, which is funded by the US government and the International Red Cross. So the state also, which is really interesting and highlights the role that Israel's interference in the US, in the large role that Israel plays in interfering in the US criminal justice system, is that the state failed to convict them in their first trial, but when they came back in their second trial, they featured testimony from an anonymous Israeli intelligence agent whom the defense team was unable to adequately question. And this was the first time in legal history that a court had ever allowed an expert witness to testify anonymously. And this expert witness was obviously an Israeli intelligence agent, as I believe, and he had an anonymous, like an anonymous identity. So, and a lot of the evidence against them was from Israeli intelligence sources. And also there was, what was it called? A notorious Islamophobe named Stephen Emerson, who runs the investigative project on terrorism, he supplied fabricated testimony central to their criminalization and their indictment. So there was a lot of that type of testimony that led to their conviction. So most of them, so they were given sentences up to 65 years in prison. And we understand that the conviction of the HLF was meant to have a chilling effect on Muslims and Arabs in this country and to hinder our ability to mobilize around social justice issues such as Palestinian self-determination. And this case was an outrageous attempt by the government to stretch the definition of material support for terrorism. And they went as far as to vilify legitimate charity work. And we know the strategy is a part of a long tradition of the US government using imprisonment and incarceration to criminalize Black and immigrant communities and to silence political activism and dissent. And their case is not only cruel and heartbreaking because they were convicted for doing nothing more than providing charity, but they're also currently held in communication management units. And those are nicknamed Guantanamo North, like Gitmo North, because they are prisons which house disproportionately high numbers of Muslims on bogus terrorism charges. So these are little Muslim prisons that they're being kept in currently. Also, this is also very sad and heartbreaking. In the last 2 weeks, we've received news that Mufid Abdul Qadir, who's one of the HLF prisoners, he's serving a 20-year sentence. He has tested positive for COVID in a federal Texas prison. He's 62 years old. He has deteriorating health conditions, like pre-existing conditions. And he's spoken to his family and his daughters about the conditions in the prison as being very harsh. If there's a group called the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, and they posted a webinar with his daughter, and they've also put out a call to action for people to support Mufid Abdul Qadir while he's in prison right now. So finally, so just quickly from the Philippines to Palestine, we know that security concerns by oppressors, the US government, the state of Israel become an official alibi for unregulated spying, surveillance, and the imprisonment of our people. And as Palestinians, we really understand that this is all a smokescreen used to stifle liberation movements. And we know that terrorism designations are used to repress revolutionary politics and political dissent. And I really believe it's incumbent upon Palestinians and Arabs in the diaspora and our allies to really continue to fight despite these setbacks and this political repression. And we really must continue to do this work for our political prisoners who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our cause and our people. And it's really important that we continue to do that. So as Palestinians, we proudly and fiercely join our Filipino comrades in saying no to the anti-terror law and calling for the full and total liberation of the Philippines. So I just wanted to close really quickly with just annexation. It was announced on July 1st that the Israeli government, in defiance of the international community, announced that they would begin steps to officially annex 30% of the West Bank. And this was a part of Trump's so-called deal of the century announced earlier this year. And we understand this annexation to not be new and a continuation of settler colonialism. This plan really instead formalizes the state of de facto annexation that's already existed on the ground, something that has existed since the beginning of the Zionist settler colonial project. And with this plan, Israel will continue to crank forward with the construction of measures that confine Palestinians to Bantustans and holding zones where Palestinians have no possibility of sovereignty. So for the last several decades, Israel has continued to do this. They've continued to maintain a brutal military occupation. With Trump, we've seen it a little differently, and we've seen an attack on Palestinians that has made him and has emboldened Israel in a way because of Trump's support. And we've seen that with like the ongoing of construction of Jewish-only settlements. We've seen the US Embassy move to Jerusalem. We've seen the defunding of UNRWA. And we've also seen the announcement of the universally rejected deal of the century. So this graphic just has some kind of geographic facts of what annexation should look like if Israel were to carry it out. And that would mean like the formal expropriation of over 30% of the West Bank, which includes over 30 Jewish-only settlements. But ultimately, as Palestinians, we understand annexation is not a singular and momentary act, and it's the continuation and consolidation of Israel's attempt to deny Palestinian self-determination. Our people will continue to resist until the land that is rightfully ours belongs to us once more and until we have realized our right of return. So we call on all levels of Palestinian society to escalate, intensify our efforts towards this national liberation despite this annexation announcement. And we call on our allies to help us in these efforts. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Reneen, for that incredibly informative presentation. You mentioned earlier that George Floyd's murderer was trained by the IDF, and it's basically foreign exchange violence. But on the other scale, I know that Palestinian activists have been on the ground providing aid and information and knowledge sharing as you're doing now with Black Lives Matter, and training them on how to be organizers and better at protesting. And thank you for connecting with the Filipinos on this anti-terror law. So our next speaker is Charles Jimenez. Charles, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Royal, and to our former speakers. Thank you very much for that very wonderful presentation. I would like to start the presentation on the Philippine struggle with a little background about the Philippines. And you can see in the slide, the Philippines is rich, but the people are poor. So in this discussion, we are going to answer why is the Philippines rich, but why are the people poor? Next slide, please. So what do we know about the Philippines? The Philippines is a tropical country in Southeast Asia. Next slide. It is an archipelago, which means a group of islands, and it has, next slide, around 7,107 islands, and they are grouped into 3 major island groups: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Next slide, please. It's a little bit smaller than Texas at 115,830 square miles. Next slide. With a population of 108 million people. Next slide. And due to forced migration, poverty, and the labor export policy, there are around 12 to 15 million Filipinos overseas with, next slide, 4.7 million Filipinos in the US, 800,000 of which are undocumented. Next slide. Inside the Philippines, there are 40 indigenous tribes, which comprises 10% of the population. They are victims of political repression, land grabbing, forced evacuation. Their ancestral lands are being taken away from them to pave way for foreign mining companies owned by the US, because the Philippines is rich in various natural resources such as gold, silver, copper, next slide, which are used for various as raw materials for various industries. Next slide. The Philippines is also rich in crops like rice, banana, coconut, next slide, lumber, oil, next slide, water resources, next slide. So in summary, the Philippines as an agricultural country, majority of the Filipinos treat land as their source of income, their life. So as we say, lupa ay buhay, or land is life. And next slide. To further understand the Philippines, we look at the demographics of the Filipino people. 75% of Filipinos are peasants, being the Philippines being an agricultural country. And the peasants and the workers, which comprise 90% of the Filipino population, they're the backbone of the Philippine society, but they're the most oppressed in the Philippine society. The peasants are victims of landlessness and land monopoly. A good example is a farmer in Central Luzon only earns around 19 cents in US dollars per day, while workers, the minimum wage in Metro Manila at most is $10 per day. So imagine living on that like low wage. 7% of Filipinos are the middle class or the petty bourgeoisie. They're the intellectuals. They're oppressed in the Philippine society by the lack of access to education and by curtailing their freedom and their civil liberties. 2% are the national bourgeoisie or the local businessmen. These local businesses in the Philippines are actually dying because they are in direct competition with foreign multinational and transnational corporations. And the 1%, the big landlords and the comprador big bourgeoisie, they own and control majority of the wealth and natural resources and even the government of the Philippines. So if you take a look at the demographics of the Filipino people, we can see why the Filipino people, even though the Philippines is rich, we can see why the Filipino people are poor, because only the few, only your 1% hold and control the various natural resources and the wealth of the Philippines. Next slide. Next slide. So as we study the history of the Philippines, in the pre-colonial times, there were already societies and in various levels and types of social organization, economic and political systems. And it already has a highly developed society in different islands in the Philippines. They still have no sense of like a Philippines yet, because the Philippines is divided into many islands, and also the Philippines itself was a name. It was a name that came from the Kingdom of Spain. So at that point, there's still no concept of the Philippines, but there's already a high level of social organization among different groups in the Philippines. So the point of this slide is to debunk the idea. The point of this slide is to debunk the idea that the Spanish colonizers brought civilization in the Philippines. Next slide. Okay, so in the 1500s, Spain came in the Philippines and colonized the Philippines. The Spaniards ruled the Philippines for 333 years. They used religion and violence to colonize the country, and they used divide and conquer tactics to be able to control the Philippines. So by divide and conquer, they allied with the upper classes, the local upper classes in the Philippines in order to get their support and be able to divide the Filipinos. So some sections of the Filipinos were actually supportive of the Spaniards because they gave them some form of control in local government. The Spain also established the hacienda system, or like it's when few people own large pieces of land. It's also landlordism, which is still still present in the Philippine society today. So these landlords in the Philippines during the Spain colonial rule, they aided in enforcing the colonial rule of the Kingdom of Spain. Next slide. So after 333 years, after the Filipinos, after the Philippine Revolution defeated the Spain, the U.S. colonized the Philippines through the same tactics, violence, through military, and they saw the Philippines as a good source of cheap raw materials, cheap labor force, and they saw the Philippines as a good entry point to Asia and a good place to dump the excess supply of their products and goods, and as a good captive market for US products. Next slide. And in 1946, when US granted the Philippines independence, the US still controls the Philippines through various institutions that it has set up during the colonial period and even after the colonial period. Politically, they fund the administrations, they fund and support the Philippine government, and in exchange, various policies being enacted by the Philippine government are actually helpful for the infiltration of US corporations in the Philippines. And various unequal treaties, economic treaties are also being enforced between the Philippine government and the US through various institutions like the USAID, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Militarily, the US has an office inside the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the JUSMAG, or the Joint US Military Assistance Group. So through that office, the US military can directly control the Philippine military, and they use the Philippine military to defend US corporations, mining corporations from local indigenous people who are defending their lands. There are also other programs such as the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement and the Mutual Defense Treaty, which aims to solidify partnership between the Philippine military and the US military. Culturally, the Philippine government are enforcing various educational reforms, and it is also perpetuating colonial mentality in which culturally we think that US goods are actually better than locally made goods. And through these educational reforms, they serve as a propaganda machine for the US for us to think that the US actually brought civilization to the Philippines and did not like kill millions of Filipino people during the US-Philippine War. And also, China has been threatening Philippine sovereignty. They've been establishing cities and military bases in the Philippine Islands in the northwestern part of the Philippines. So in summary, we can say that the Philippines is foreign dominated by these unequal treaties and relations by the Philippine government and the US and China. Next. And we can say that the Philippine economy is pre-industrial and backward agrarian. Next, please. So in this picture, we can see in the left, it's an Egyptian hieroglyphic that was thousands of years ago. Keyword is ancient Egypt. And on the right, you can see present day Philippines using the same farming methods. So the local ruling classes in the Philippines and the foreign imperialist and their foreign imperialist masters have maintained the backward economic situation in the Philippines in order to prevent the people from progressing. Next slide. And even up until today, haciendas are still present in the Philippines. So there are big landlord corporations, big land masses owned by few families, and even though 75% of Filipino people are peasants, they don't have land rights and they don't own the land that they till. Next, please. But the good thing is, all throughout Philippine history, we can say that the unifying thread of Philippine history is actually the struggle of the Filipino people to be free. During the pre-colonial period, we have the local tribes led by Lapu-Lapu and other tribes in the Philippines, other groups in the Philippines who fought against Spanish invaders. During the Spanish colonial rule, there were at least 200 revolts, local revolts, all throughout the Philippines in order to liberate the Philippines, which all culminated in the formation of the Katipunan, which is a group that struggled. They waged a national democratic revolution and called for Philippine independence. They were successful, but the US came. But the struggle of the Filipino people did not stop. We can see a lot of groups in the north. There's the Tagalog Republic, led by Macario Sakay in the picture. In Visayas, there's the Colorum, and in the south, there's the struggle of the Moro people, in order for genuine Philippine independence. And during the neo-colonial period, the National Democratic Movement, through the establishment of Kabataan Makabayan and other organizations, have continued to fight until this day for genuine national democracy in the Philippines. And when we say national democracy, it is national in a sense that we want to establish a Philippine society that is genuinely free from any foreign intervention. And it is democratic because it aspires to grant all the democratic aspirations of the people. So that's land rights, job security, wages, right to education, and general civil liberties and democratic rights for the people. Next, please. Yeah, so unlike other conventional histories, the unifying thread of Philippine history is the struggle of the peoples themselves against various forms of oppression, from Spanish conquest and colonization to US imperialism. Next, please. I'll pass the mic to Sarah to discuss the current situation of the Philippines.
Thank you so much, Charles, for trying to capture so many different periods all in one. And thank you for everyone else who's here today, for the speakers that have come to connect our struggles, but also to stand in solidarity with one another as we continue to struggle on. The current Philippine situation is definitely one that is heartbreaking, because this is dire, dark times in the Philippines. But I also want to encourage folks that with the darkness, with the repression, we hope to increase and strengthen the resistance. So prior to, I think before we get into the anti-terrorism law, most people are here wanting to, or most Filipinos have now heard of the anti-terrorism law. Before we get into that, which has gone into effect today, US time, I do want to talk about how the Philippine situation has been before this law has passed. We've seen since Duterte has been in power, 30,000 who have been killed in extrajudicial killings under this war on drugs, which actually was just a war on the people. Just this year alone, as the world has faced a global pandemic, we've seen de facto martial law in how the president has handled COVID-19. Instead of increasing the resources for frontliners and for those who are in medical professions all throughout the country, there's been an increase in military presence and checkpoints throughout the country. It started within the capital with Manila, and then it extended to Luzon, which is the main central island, and then it extended throughout different parts of the different islands from the north and the south. This has resulted in an increase of poverty. To issue a lockdown like this has not given the people a chance to eat, to survive. It has increased the instability for workers. And we've seen that both here in the US with J1 workers, we've seen that with seafarers who make up a huge population of the seafaring industry. We've also seen that with workers in the Philippines themselves, for folks who were returning home, for OFWs that were returning home. They've been stuck in the mainland. They have not been able to see their families. They've been separated, and to have that type of lockdown, that quarantine that was militarized, it made folks desperate, to find food, to take care of their families. Those who were violating curfew, there were attacks on them. They were put in dog cages. They were asked to sit in the sun for hours as their punishment. We've seen sexual harassment with women for violating their curfew. And that's come directly from police that have been heavily policing different communities. We've also seen direct attacks on community leaders who have been helping resource their communities. And of course, this has all resulted even in the increase of COVID-19 cases. The Philippines in Southeast Asia has some of the highest cases, even though it is small compared to the US. It is definitely high right now. And yes, dog cages, that's correct. We've also seen the attack on the press. ABS-CBN, which is our largest, broadest broadcasting network in the Philippines for news, they were asked to go off the air. And Rappler CEO and founder Maria Ressa was also found guilty of libel. We've seen protesters who haven't been violating COVID-19 regulations arrested. 20 protesters were arrested at the Pride Parade last month, and they were, the right amount of distance between each other. They were all wearing masks, and they were arrested. Thankfully, they were released. However, we see these arrests, especially with activists and for folks who are speaking up against this administration. We're definitely seeing the violence against them. On the right, you see the timeline of terror in Cabuyao, which is in Laguna, in southern Tagalog. 11 were violently arrested. It was captured on tape, how they were also approached by the police and arrested. Tinay Palabay, who was a guest speaker that we've had at another webinar of Malaya Movement, she was served an arrest warrant by someone who was undercover. They posed as a delivery person. Judge Senados is the 50th judge to be killed under Duterte's regime. And Judge Senados was also the judge who was in charge of letting the Pride 20 go. So was in charge of their release. We also see the attacks on faith leaders. Pastor Dan San Andres from Carapatan was also arrested recently, is still facing a double murder charge. We see multiple arrests. This isn't enough to fit everyone. I was going through pictures trying to figure out, who to include in this, and many are community leaders. Some are elderly it really is folks who are helping their community and speaking up. And they have been what we call red tagged, which is they've been made an enemy of this state. They've been criminalized. They've been attacked and harassed in order to rationalize how they're being treated right now. Some have even been abducted and will go as far as assassination attempts, which we'll cover in the next slide. But also ABS-CBN tried to appeal their shutdown, and in response, they were denied that, and that's also recent. So this is all leading up to the anti-terrorism law. Next slide, please. On the left, we see Jory. Jory was another community leader who was killed and was killed for being red tagged. Now, the term red tagged, it comes from the connection to, it's not just being made an enemy of the state, but they say, you know, you're a communist, you are a supporter of the New People's Army of the Philippines. For folks who have been community leaders or journalists, lawyers, student activists, to be red tagged, even though it's not illegal to be a communist in the Philippines, even though it is not bad to be a communist, it's been a death sentence. And so Jory was shot multiple times, and his own family could not even attend his funeral because of this national quarantine. On the right, you also see Anne and Elena, who are elderly activists who were abducted. Anne was later, the fake news was spread about Anne that was saying, you know, she had confessed to being part of a part of this terrorist group, and it wasn't true. Anne was able to get the word out that no, I was abducted. I was taken to this place. That is not true at all. Elena, also another advocate for workers, for the farmers, was taken from her home. And again, this is all recent news that's been happening. And it doesn't even cover all the attacks. Next slide, please. So like Charles had mentioned, the great news about learning the history of the Philippines is to see that throughout the oppression, throughout our history, the people have been always fighting back. They have fought back their oppressors. And these are just two pictures in which we see that. The anti-terrorism law, the reason why it is so alarming for us is because we have already seen this red tagging. We have already seen the attacks on the people. And this term terrorism is broadened to the point where they are going to try to measure intent. We've seen the planting of weapons, of drugs, and to criminalize someone and to put that type of death sentence on them. This would actually just make it illegal. Some supporters of this bill, which is now a law, have said that they wouldn't need martial law with this law going into effect. They wouldn't need martial law. This would legalize what they have been doing. And that's why lawyers and activists, community leaders, human rights defenders are fighting back. It doesn't take just the legislative and the legal forms in order to fight back. It really takes mobilizing the masses, mobilizing the people, educating folks on what is truly happening in the Philippines, but also how to take part in this fight, in this resistance. It takes people, it takes great organizing, it takes community, and it's worth it, whether or not we are affected directly by it. Part of this law is going to extend to us here, but even so, it's already been happening. So all the more the need to speak up. The picture on the right is from the 8th, which was when we expected President Duterte to let it lapse into law. However, he decided to sign it. We still did a global day of action. And even though we are small, we had great support from our allies. We could not have done that without you all in Dallas, in Austin, and in Houston. This type of mass organizing is the movement that we need. On the left, you see that lawyers have taken legal petitions in order to counter the anti-terror law. And so in the start of my presentation, we talk about the terror timeline. That that goes back before this law has taken place. You know, extrajudicial killings by masked gunmen who have been hired by the police. Police have even admitted, you know, sometimes we've had to pretend to hold them accountable. We've had to arrest them on in front of the cameras and then, you know, let them go after the cameras are off. These acts of terror have been attacks, direct attacks on the people. And all we're doing is making sure that those attacks do not happen. Next slide, please. Attorney Edre Olalia has said, "It ain't over yet. We will not cease to exhaust any and all legitimate steps and platforms to challenge this draconian law. This without doubt is the most unpopular and perilous piece of legislation that could ever be pushed by a government that is fixated with the potion of power. In time, we will look back to this day of infamy and say the unbridled and terrorizing power of the government will always bend and retreat eventually when the people push back hard enough." And it's true. We rallied throughout the US, even globally. We've contacted our representatives, and in 2 days we had 39 representatives signed on. And then in 2 days, it really grew to 50. 39 to 50, that took 2 days. And it was just amazing to see those representatives speak up and stand in solidarity with the Philippines, and to really understand what this law was going to do to the Philippine people. 2 of them are from Texas, so we thank them for speaking up. But again, this is only one way that we can fight this legislative effort. There's only one way to do that. And we'll definitely get to some of that in the Q&A. But like we said, you know, this is the beginning. We would like to introduce the Philippine Human Rights Act to Congress, to the Senate. We want them to stop US funding. We are complicit as US citizens in funding these human rights violations that are happening in the Philippines. And so we need to end that support to the Philippine police and to the Philippine military. But not just that, we need to hold those people accountable who have been oppressing the Philippine masses. So with that, this is just the beginning. This is part of our fight together. We stand in solidarity with Palestine. We stand in solidarity with Black lives, but we also do not hesitate to uplift each other's narratives and to make sure that our voices are heard. Ako si Sarah Halandoan. I'm Sarah Halandoan. Aktivista ako, hindi ako terorista. I'm an activist, I'm not a terrorist. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really informative. I learned a lot. And thank you for the other panelists that shared and provided everybody with such vast information. I learned so much today. So with that said, wanted to synthesize what, you know, to kind of wrap everything up with what was shared. Not only do we see parallels of these issues from the Marcos regime, we also observe the rise of fascism around the world today. Similar struggles of political repression as well as and state brutality are occurring amidst the COVID-19 health crisis. Just today, we have learned that protesters in Portland are being detained in unmarked vans by federal officers in fatigues with no government or police insignias on their uniforms. Protesters demanding justice for Breonna Taylor are getting arrested and hit with felony charges while her murderers run free. And if you're hit with a felony charge, you have to jump through many hoops just to be able to vote again. So this is all very intentional.
We can see how intentional it is looking at the systemic red tagging and marking and falsely identifying communities of just false claims and false accusations. And that's all even before the pandemic, where governments have not served the interests of the people, including social services and health services, especially now during the time of COVID.
Any form of resistance or dissent to stand up for human rights is immediately painted in a negative light through misinformation smear campaigns. Black dissent is characterized as Black radicalism. Indigenous and environmental activists labeled as New People's Army in the Philippines, and turning the term Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist, into a negative buzzword for people who loot and riot.
On the other hand, though, it's so encouraging and great to see just us on this webinar, all 150 plus of us getting together in solidarity is already a testament to the events that we can do and the progress that we can make when we link arms.
There's a dire need for solidarity among our communities to build a better future where people and human rights are prioritized over profits. We don't have to look across the ocean into foreign lands to see these injustices. These are also happening on American soil or wherever country you're from.
From IDF, military assistance, aid to repressed communities around the world, using our own, even American tax dollars to do that.
Let's continue this work together through collaborations, knowledge sharing, and supporting one another's causes.
With that, I think it's time for some questions. I believe we're going to have some time to maybe do about 2 per panelist. So I appreciate all the questions that y'all have been putting in the Q&A. We're going to take a look and send some over. So let's do this. Royal, do you want to ask the first one?
Okay, this one is for Jennifer. How did the original intent of the police capturing enslaved peoples become covert and packaged into protection for all? In other words, how have police been decriminalized and uncoupled from their original purpose?
Yeah, so that is actually an excellent question. So economic elites in the 19th century repackaged the kind of changing of how policing should be in the United States as a means of maintaining order and controlling crime, as well as bringing up unruly races, which in this case means immigrants, people struggling with addiction, as well as Black people. I believe, honestly, that the police have not been uncoupled from their original purpose. Their function today is still to protect private property, maintain the status quo so that business can conduct as normal, and continues to criminalize Black and Brown communities through the unfair enforcement of drug laws, as well as laws that goes beyond like the police, right? Like laws that are passed down that give stiffer punishments. For example, one good example is crack cocaine, which is often used by Black and Brown poor people, versus powder cocaine, which is often used by rich and white people. It's the same drug, but the penalties for crack cocaine use and crack cocaine possession are much stiffer, right? And also, since the 13th Amendment actually allows for slavery, if someone is imprisoned, we see that companies use prison labor in order to hit their bottom line in a much better way, right? They pay criminally low wages for the things that they have these prisoners use and create. AT&T is a good example. They actually use prisoners in their call centers. And basically anything that you have that's labeled made in USA, you can be sure was made by a prisoner. So if anything, I think that there's been a very successful propaganda and disinformation campaign to paint the police as a force for good, but when you actually look at what they actually do, that's not the case.
Thank you, Jennifer. The next one we have is for Reneen. Reneen, the question here says, does the conflict between Palestine and Israel stem primarily from religious differences?
Yeah, so that's a good one. I think that question often comes up and it can be debunked really quickly because that's often a common tactic from Zionists and their supporters. And what they do is they attempt to faith wash the issue of Palestine and make it an issue where they reframe their occupation and they reframe the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians as being one of a century-long conflict between Jewish and Muslim people. And so they get to do that, so then they don't have to take accountability for what's really going on, which is that what's going on in Palestine is a settler colonial project. And what's really going on is that Israel has a settler colonial history, and they have oppressed and they continue to oppress the Palestinian people. So it's just another tactic that Zionists often like to use to either not misplace, but it's just that they use. But I would say that it's not a religious conflict. We, like I said before, we understand what's going on in Palestine to be a settler colonial project, and the Zionist project really has specific aims. And from its inception, and from Israel's inception to the way that Israel functions now, even and a lot of Zionists will talk about what's going on in Palestine, like a lot of liberal Zionists will talk about needing to end the occupation of Palestine, and we'll talk about the fact that, you know, this is just a right-wing government. But it's the main party, the Likud party in Israel, has a clear vision that they clearly state, and it's about settler colonial expansion, right? It's about like taking over the West Bank. It's about like upholding the settler colonial project, and it's clear what they want. And so I would say, no, it's not a religious project, and Israel's really clear about what they want, and we see them do these things. We see them enact this project with how they treat Palestinians.
Thank you so much, Reneen. The next question is either for Charles or Sarah. What are the limitations of seeking assistance through the US legislative system? I ask because until recently, when Duterte broke off the military deal they had with the US, it seems the Philippines enjoyed plenty of US support. Are there US congresspeople who seem willing to help?
I can answer that. Or Charles, you want to?
You can answer, Sarah. I'll just add if I feel.
Awesome. Well, yeah, there's definitely some limitations for sure. It's just so, I mean, the US already has like geopolitical and economical, like they have that economical motivation and geopolitical motivation as well. So it's there for sure are limitations. Like that's a great question. But we do have great allies like Jan Schakowsky from Illinois, who definitely spoke up and who initiated that condemnation letter regarding the anti-terrorism law. And then who we were able to gather support like from Judy Chu, and again, the 50 representatives across the US. It's also difficult because that what you were referring to, like again, this is a great question. The VFA agreement was only terminated in word. So the visiting forces agreement, that allyship with the U.S. in which the U.S. military presence can train in the Philippines, and that allyship, Philippines will never go against the U.S. U.S. will never go against the Philippines. That allyship has been strong for years throughout different administrations. That termination of the VFA agreement actually was only in word. The US presence is still there. And definitely the limitations are disheartening. When we've reached out to representatives, I got word from mine today saying, I will not support in this capacity, but we do condemn, the human rights violations that do happen. We support in our presence. And so, yeah, it's disheartening, but in a short nutshell, that's just some of the limitations and problems that we've had facing that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Let's see. We're doing 2 questions each panelist. The next one, again, is for Jennifer. Let me see. Was COINTELPRO seeking to infiltrate all multiracial groups seeking Black liberation? And did their tactics to disrupt differ in any way between Black activists and allies?
So actually, COINTELPRO infiltrated all multiracial groups seeking Black and Chicanx liberation, as well as leftist groups and organizations. Their tactics differed in that in Black activist groups, they assassinated multiple people, such as Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton. They also were complicit. They also assassinated an ally as well of the Black Panther Party. She was a white woman. Her name doesn't come to me right now. I apologize. But another thing that they did is they also sowed division between the different groups that were fighting for better labor rights, Black and Chicanx liberation, and as well as LGBTQ liberation. They actually infiltrated those groups to sow division between them in order to further destabilize their solidarity work.
Powerful. Thank you. Next question, Reneen. Are there any ways we can help the Holy Land 5, especially considering the whole COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, so there's an organization called the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, and this organization is actively working with the families of the political prisoners here in the United States. So they not only have helped the families of the Holy Land 5, but they're also actively working with other families who are in similar situations where their loved ones are political prisoners here in the United States and were facing, or maybe they were facing and now they're in prison, or they're currently facing charges related to terrorism or FBI entrapment cases. And so they primarily work with Muslim political prisoners here in the United States that are dealing with that. There's also, so the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, they actively put out like call to actions. So the one I mentioned earlier, was a call to action they put out. So we can drop a link for them. You can follow their Facebook page and it'll link all their information. Also, the PYM with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms and the Daughters of the Holy Land Foundation 5 co-wrote a statement on the anniversary of their 10 years of imprisonment. So now they've been imprisoned more than a decade, but when that anniversary came out, we wrote a statement just really highlighting their case and calling people to remember them and push for and help them in any way we can. And so we can also link that in the chat. And then finally, there's a really good documentary called The Holy Land 5, but it's an Al Jazeera documentary. It's on YouTube that really highlights their case and really breaks down the role that the state of Israel and these informants played in their case, and just like the political repression that they were facing and they continue to face as Palestinians imprisoned in the US right now. And then finally, there's a book called, what's it called? It's called Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land 5, and it outlines their case too. It's actually by Miko Piled. He's an Israeli-American activist, and he wrote that book, and he's a very close friend of their family. So if you want to learn more about them, I really recommend those resources, watching that documentary, and then looking out for anything that the Coalition for Civil Freedoms puts out, because that organization is really doing important work for political prisoners here in the United States. So we can share all those links with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reneen. And the next question would be for the Philippine panelist. Now that the anti-terror law is in effect, many Filipinos on social media, both the Philippines and the diaspora, are apolitical on their social media feeds. However, should we as activists continue to post hashtags in opposition to the anti-terror law?
I can answer the question. Actually, there are a lot of like activists and even non-activists who are speaking up against the anti-terror law in social media. And actually, it has been trending many times. The hashtags junk terror law and hashtag oust Duterte. So it is important for us to continue in criticizing and like showing all our opinions, because like speaking up is not a crime. It is definitely not terrorism. It The Philippine government's step in like ramping up and using the full terrorist might of the state to further criminalize dissent is actually a symptom of the government not being able to control the population. So it's more there we should be more encouraged to be more proactive and be more vocal in our stance against the dictatorship and against political repression, since it shows that there's a growing broad united front against the dictatorship of Duterte, and it's only it's now more than ever, it is very important for us to be more vocal at this time in order for us to show that we are organized and we are many and we can and will not cower. And history has shown that it has happened during the Marcos dictatorship, and history has shown that no amount of fascism and political repression can silence the people, both in the urban areas and the rural areas, and even any part of the world. So if we organize ourselves and we get organized, it is we will be very much stronger. So it is very important for us to join organizations in our areas. So yeah, join Anakbayan.
And join your local orgs. I think, thank you, Charles. That's a perfect segue to our calls to action. Many among them being joining your local organizations, because Charles said it so powerfully. Like the more we organize with each other and in solidarity with other orgs, right? That's when we really start to get the work done. So I'll hand it over to our speakers, or Royal, I'll let you add on and then also hand it over to our speakers.
Oh, yes. There's actually fear of speaking out as one person because there's a fear of being singled out. But like, our previous panelists have said, if you join an organization, you are not just one single person, you are many. So they can't just target you. You're part of an organization, and you can speak through them. And the more that we join together, the more that we see, that they see that we're not cowering. And yeah, the calls to action, the slides in order, we have Reneen.
So just quickly, I just want to invite everyone to join the PYM and Samidun in the Day of Resistance. We're planning actions from August 7th to 9th, and it's just more annexation actions. Help us come out and say no to annexation and support us. And you can follow us for more information. We'll be sending out in each of our respective locations in Texas and across the US and in Canada, because we have chapters in Canada. And then also, if you're a Palestinian and Arab youth, we want you to get involved with us, and we've included a link to join the PYM.
And this one is for Jennifer Miller.
Yeah, so Our call to action is actually tomorrow at 1 p.m. We're going to be having a justice caravan to free them all in regards to people that are in prison or in jails, as well as juvenile detention centers because of COVID-19. Actually, Dallas County Jail and 70% of the inmates in Dallas County Jail haven't even been convicted of a crime. They're just there because they can't afford their bail. And because of that, we need to especially come out and show out to make it be known that we don't want them to be in there, especially during COVID-19. And it's going absolutely crazy in Dallas County jails right now. So there's a QR code. You can go ahead and scan that with your phone. We also have a link there. It's just kutt.it/G Jul 18th protest.
Thank you. And Sarah, this is for you.
Hi, yes, thank you. Yes, please sign the petition, the PHRA petition with the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. Help us introduce this bill to your legislators. Contact your local representatives, let them know that you support the defunding of the Philippine military and Philippine army. Speak up, just like they said, exercise your right to freedom of speech. Do not let them silence you. Help us junk the anti-terrorism law and introduce the Philippine Human Rights Act. Next slide. You can also join and donate to Malaya Movement Texas. Here is our link, but also our save the date is July 27th, the People's State of the Nation address in Houston. So every year the president will give his State of the Nation address. We'll say, what a great job he's doing. In response, the people will protest and let the world know really what he's doing and the true state of the nation. So please join us for our second annual July 27th People's State of the Nation address outside the Philippine consulate. There will be caravans coming from Dallas and Austin, and you can sign up right over here in this link. Thank you.
And I want to invite everybody to take screenshots, type this all out, follow the links, and they are being posted also on the chat. And now there's 2 pages, so so that's why I suggest the screenshots. It's a lot. Awesome. And if you guys stick around for a little bit and take the exit poll, it would be highly helpful for us for future webinars and to reach out to you all. Thank you for attending and sharing in this lively conversation in the chat. We appreciate you so much.
Just want to amplify what Royal shared. I'm seeing all these polls coming in, and it's amazing. Please keep it up and let us know what you think. Sign up for those email lists so we can get you those actions and these slides as well as some of the answers that some of the answers to the questions that we didn't get to. Our panelists have been hard at work answering those behind the scenes off camera for you. So we're happy to send those, but do make sure that you sign up. Sign up.
Yeah, and Malaya, Texas is now a chapter. We would love to have folks in the Houston area join in these events. Again, like we mentioned earlier, it isn't the time to remain apolitical, especially we still have our freedom of speech. And, the stronger we are as a group, the harder we fall.